Hello, and welcome to today's session. This is the first of 5 planned sessions to discuss the 2022 edition of ASCE 7. My name is Jennifer Goupil, and I am a Senior Manager of Codes and Standards at SEI. My job is to oversee all of the standards development and adoption. Today, we will be hitting the highlights from the recently published minimum design loads and associated criteria for buildings and other structures, more commonly known as ASCE 7. So with that, I'd like to get started by introducing my guests. Ron Hamburger, Senior Principal at Simpson, Gumpertz & Hager, has more than 30 years of experience in design, construction, education, research, evaluation, investigation, and repair of commercial, institutional, industrial facilities. He's an internationally recognized expert in performance-based structural, earthquake, and blast engineering. He has played a leading role in development of national structural engineering standards and building code provisions. Following the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, Ron served as the lead investigator into the collapse of New York's twin World Trade Center towers on behalf of Structural Engineering Institute of ASCE and FEMA. Ron is a sought-after speaker and has lectured at the University of California at Berkeley, UCLA, Stanford, and numerous other academic institutions and conferences. He's chaired and is past president of countless committees and organizations, which I will not list here today, Ron, but he has also won nearly every award there is to give, including the prestigious ASCE SEI Walter P. Moore Award. He's a fellow of SEI, and lucky for us all, Ron is the current and past chair of the ASCE 7 main committee. Welcome, and thanks for joining me today, Ron.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. And by the way, it's more than 47 years of experience doing all of
that. Okay, I'll correct that. Also with me today is Greg Soules. Greg is a principal structural engineer and technical authority for seismic and wind engineering with CB&I, located in the Woodlands, Texas. CB&I is a global engineering procurement and construction company working in the energy market. CB&I is one of the largest designers of steel plate structures in the world. He has worked for CB&I in various engineering roles for more than 30 years. And Greg holds a BS, MS, and Ph.D. degree in civil engineering from Texas Tech and an MBA from the University of Houston. Greg is a fellow of SEI and ASCE, and additionally to serving as vice chair of the ASCE 7 main committee for the last 2 cycles, he's an active member on many of the subcommittees, including general provision, seismic and wind subcommittees, as well as serving as the chair of the non-building structural task committee. Greg has also served as chair of the Environmental Loads Committee of ASCE 37, which is the design loads on structures during construction, and the ASCE Task Committee for Seismic Evaluation of Design of Petrochemical Facilities. Welcome to you, Greg.
Well, thank you. And sort of like Ron, it's more than 42 years in my case.
All right. Well, you guys need to update your bios then. All right. With all of that out of the way, we're ready to get started. I wanted to spend a little bit of time up front kind of talking about some non-technical aspects of ASCE 7. Wanted to kind of kick it off with a big picture discussion of the standard, how it's referenced, how it's used, all of how it gets updated, all of those things before we kind of get to the nitty-gritty technical. So first of all, I wanted to say congratulations to you both. We made it. We actually published ASCE 722 back in December, and I feel like this was an amazing accomplishment given that the last 2 years of our 5-year cycle was done in the global pandemic. And in fact, the very last business trip I took before we basically were shut down was to Houston for our ASCE 7 main committee meeting, back when we all thought this was just a little West Coast issue that was going to go away. With that, I'm going to start off with you, Ron. Now that we're published, I wish we could say we're done, but you know, as I do, that we're not quite done. So why don't you start us off with how does it 722, how will that start to get used? How is it referenced? Let's talk about like that for a tiny little bit.
Happy to do that. First of all, before I do that, though, I want to acknowledge your substantial contribution to the development of the 722 standard. Jennifer, acting as ASCE staff and also a voting member of the committee, spent countless hours in making this all happen. And it was a very challenging cycle. Not only were we interrupted by COVID, but we lost a meeting at the beginning of the cycle due to a blizzard in Denver. And there were other trepidations that we had to undergo. But we have completed it and we're very happy about that. So back to your question.
Thank you, Ron.
How do people know about the new standard? Well, the most important way to let people know about the new standard is by introducing it into the building code, where it is a primary reference for structural design criteria. And indeed, as you know, because you were a big part of this as well, we have just submitted to the International Code Council a series of proposals to update the International Building Code to reference ASCE 722 in lieu of ASCE 716. That will be the way that most people will learn about the new standard. But of course, Structure Magazine and many other professional journals and magazines that we all read will let people know that 722 is now available.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, many industry standards, including those referenced by the petroleum industry, the chemical industry, the power industry, also reference ASCE 7, and people who use those standards will learn of it by the change that occurs in those standards referencing our new document.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, I mean, we don't have to wait till it comes out as an adopted document into the IBC. As you know, I don't know if you've heard, I heard from Washington State that they're going to be preparing some proposals to adopt 722 to be able to use our new seismic provisions, which Greg will share with us a little bit later. But some jurisdictions can go ahead and start getting used, start using that document as they see fit. All right, Greg, I want to turn it over to you for a second. Would you like to talk a little bit about the standard and how it gets updated, not necessarily the development process, but how do new topics get into ASCE 7? Where does this, I mean, we have a 5-year cycle, but some of these things take longer.
Well, sure. We get a new edition, every 6 years. We work on it for 5 years. And then the change proposals are generated from both inside ASCE 7 committee and outside from the public. And some of these are the result of public comments obtained during the previous cycle that we just couldn't address at that time. So many of the change proposals may just be tweaks to current provisions. Some are wholesale revisions based on improved understanding or research of the loading. In seismic, we add new structural systems very often, or entirely new loadings. In 2016, we added tsunami, and in 2022, we've added tornadoes.
Mm-hmm. Those efforts, particularly tsunami, particularly tornado, but also several of those that you mentioned within the seismic chapter really are worked on by other entities. Other federal agencies have put their resources behind some of these for decades-long studies. We work closely in partnership with a group community called the Building Seismic Safety Council, who develops quite a few change proposals, mostly funded from FEMA, I think. Yes. You are both actively involved in that, and so I just wanted to put that out there to the audience. The 7 committee does do a lot of work. The roster is more than 400 members are on the committee, but it's also these other agencies, and not just for the window of that cycle, but longer, I think is what I was wanting to share as well, some of those other efforts.
I think it's, in addition to FEMA, I think it's also important to note NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who does an incredible amount of work developing wind maps and almost single-handedly developed the criteria in the new tornado chapter.
Yeah, that's very true. The development process, we can touch about that a little bit. Greg, we started to go into that, but Ron or Greg, if you want to talk about maybe that stakeholder group, how does that actually get formed in ASCE 7? Where the folks come from, and what does that cycle look like?
You know, the membership, as you said, is very large. There are about 400 participants in the committee. We take great care when we form the committee every 6 years to make sure that it represents a very broad consensus community from the design and construction areas of practice. We solicit broadly for interest of people who want to participate. The steering committee for the committee gets together early in the process and screens all of the applications. By the way, any ASCE member can participate as a member. If you're interested in being a member of the ASCE 7 committee, or for that matter, any standards committee operated by ASCE, and you're a member, you have the right to be a member. This last cycle, we had about 400 people. Many of them are design professionals, not all building design professionals, some designing of industrial facilities, some electrical transmission facilities, all types of engineers and architects, building officials, college professors, and general contractors. So it's a very broad swath of the building community that participates in it.
It is, and we're required actually by our ANSI rules to have a balance of membership on that committee. We look carefully at those applicants in the roster to try to make sure we are representing the entire profession and stakeholder groups. Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about the balloting process, including the public comment?
Well, sure. The change proposals, they're developed, they're debated and balloted within subcommittees. Then those ballot comments are resolved within the subcommittee. This is a consensus process. It's not majority rule. One person with a logical and persuasive argument can turn an approval into a disapproval very quickly, or vice versa. When successful proposals move on to the main committee for another round of balloting, and the main committee is usually made up of a more diverse group of structural engineer members. And their comments resolved by the subcommittee, and assuming the proposal is successful, then goes on to a public comment period. And we get comments from the public. In some cases, the comments are new work for the committee for the next cycle. Maybe some editorial fixes. If there's ever a, oh my gosh, life safety issue that's pointed out, then it means a major stop for us, but that hasn't happened in my memory. And then if the proposals survive that final stage, they're incorporated into the new edition.
Yeah, the public comment is a very robust process. And in fact, I would say, and you guys can chime in on that, you participate in a lot of other organizations, I'm told. ASCE's balloting process, although it can be tedious, we do review and have to respond to all negative comments that come back from every voting member, but also the associate members. The associate members, their votes are not included in the tally for whether a proposal is successful or not. But the fact that we have to adjudicate every single comment that comes in, again, I've been told, while tedious, it actually is a very nice way of making sure that all those voices are heard. So I think it is a very rigorous process, as you all know.
It is.
It's a 6-year process to align with the building code development process. Ron touched on that briefly at the start, but that really does drive our effort. We have to get started right away at the end of the cycle. And the reason we do that to align with every other cycle of the I-code development process. As Ron mentioned earlier, we will be attending the code hearings here at the end of March and early April. We've submitted about close to 40 change proposals to align with what the technical content is within ASCE 7. And so we'll take that forward into the building code and see how that goes. It's a two-step process. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of attending, you could watch it online if you so desire. They live stream the entire thing. So we will go through this process here this year in 2022, and then we'll start kicking off the next process. Ron, do you want to talk a little bit about when we're going to kick off that process and what that might look like? Because I know folks are interested to know when they might be able to apply for the 2020.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So we're going to keep the 722 committee intact probably through most of 2022. And there's a few reasons for doing that. One of them is to shepherd the standard into the International Building Code and make sure it gets there. And that will take a lot of work from a lot of us still, even though the proposals have been submitted. And also we'll be handling a few supplements because as hard as we work through the consensus process that Greg described, we still find that there are things that need to be tweaked a little bit after the first volume is published, and so we're working on that as well. But later this year, probably in the third or fourth quarter, we will thank all 400 of the members that participated, dismiss them from service on ASCE 7, and ask if they wish to submit applications, just as anyone here at this meeting today can do. Anyone can submit an application for membership and will be considered. I'd also like to state in that vein, adding to what Greg said, that in addition to public comment, a major source of our change proposals is people who are not members of the committee that themselves submit proposals. And anyone can go to the ASCE 7 webpage, which is under the SEI website, and you can download a form that you can use to submit a proposal to make changes to ASCE 7. And we hope you do that, because as the leadership of ASCE 7, our hope is to make the standard usable and useful. And we can best do that by responding to the comments we receive from all of you. So Jennifer, having said that preamble, I forgot what your question was.
No, I think you hit it. It was that we're still not quite done with 722. We're working on these supplements. So the next cycle will be 728, which is the 2028 edition of the standard. And we will probably open the call for that late this year and really get started in earnest in 2023. But one of those things I wanted to touch on was the supplements that Ron is referring to. At least the last two cycles where I've been involved, we've gone through the process knowing that we will have to have a supplement to coordinate with our materials standards development organization. So we work very hard to make sure that we coordinate where possible with the steel industry and the steel standards, the wood industry and the wood standards, the masonry standard, and the concrete standard. So because of the way that the ICC cycle is every 3 years, ASCE 7 hits it every 6 years, so every other one. We're on the same cycle as the steel folks and not on the same cycle as wood and concrete, so we can coordinate with them. This year, we weren't able to meet the timeline for coordination with the masonry standard just based on their schedule. We knew this years ago, we knew what they were doing. So part of the industry-wide coordination that we actually lead is to try to understand those schedules and when everybody's coming out with their documents so that we can be as coordinated as possible across the structural design standards. So the first supplement that we do every cycle is kind of to pick up some of those pick up some of those standards that we weren't able to get to in the cycle. So that was one of the things that Ron was talking about. I just wanted to put that forward because we really do try at ASCE 7 to make sure that we're coordinated across all the structural design standards. All right, we're getting there, but I just want to talk about a couple of two different things before we get into the technical presentation. Greg, I want you to talk a little bit about maybe the history of ASCE 7. How long has ASCE been doing this, and maybe where did that document come from?
Well, sure. The first edition of ASCE 7 was 1988, just a few years ago. And it was an update of NCA 58.1. And the last edition of that was 1982. ASCE took over the standard from ANSI and has been updating it ever since.
Yeah.
At the time, there were 3 model building codes. Maybe hard for some people to remember that. And they tended to borrow information from ASCE 7 by reproducing various maps and tables, maybe an occasional reference, but no overall big reference. And then with the introduction of the IBC in 2000, there were more direct references to ASCE 7, and that's pretty much the norm, with some minor modifications. But pretty much for the loads, the IBC says go to ASCE 7.
We sure try.
Yes.
We keep trying. Okay, Ron, last question before we're going to head into our technical presentation. Would you tell the good folks why it's important to use the newest versions of the document?
It's an excellent question. In fact, while Greg was speaking, I was looking at the Q&A and noted that someone asked a question about local building codes and the fact that they don't always reference the latest edition of ASCE 7. It's important, I think, to use the latest edition of the standard because it really does represent the best consensus of the profession as to what is appropriate to use for design. One of the big things we do, as I'll be telling you in a few minutes when we go through the slides, each cycle is to update the hazard maps, the snow maps, the seismic maps, the wind maps, based on latest data and latest scientific understanding. And it is important to use that latest data. We also make many changes to the standard that are based on what we call lessons learned from poor performance. If there's a fire, an earthquake, a hurricane, and it causes poor performance, members of the committee, as well as other members of the profession at large, go and do investigations as to why did that poor performance occur. And we use those lessons that are learned directly in modifying the next edition of the standard to try to make sure that we build better construction going forward than we did in the past. Now, going back to the question posted on the Q&A, there is an issue that many municipalities only adopt a new edition of the building code every 10 or 15 years or so. And some are still referencing ASCE 705 or ASCE 702, or maybe even an earlier edition. My recommendation in those conditions, I think from a perspective of professional liability, we are bound not only to design to the current building codes in the locality we are practicing, but we're required by professional ethics to design such that we guard the safety and the well-being of the public. And design to the latest standard is the best way that we can do that. So, you know, if you're designing something in a community that adopts ASCE 702, and the snow loads in that standard aren't all they should be, and all that we know they should be today, and a blizzard comes by and the roof collapses as a result of drifts that weren't considered in the design, we could still be sued for that, right? But just because the municipality is still using ASCE 702, as design professionals, we're supposed to understand what the latest standard is and use it. Having said that, I think it is important also to make sure that if we're going to use the updated standard in the community that hasn't adopted it, we check with the building department first, just to make sure they will accept it, because sometimes they won't. Usually they will.